how to show episode artwork in podcast apps, and yes, even in Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining me for the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. You already know that your podcast needs top-level podcast cover art to look great in all the podcast apps and directories. You can also further enhance the experience for your audience, create promotional assets, and reinforce your branding by making unique artwork for each episode. But you need to compensate for how each app might display the episode image, especially Apple Podcasts. And if you have ever tried to work with episode artwork, you probably have experienced the Apple Podcast problem, or you've probably seen other podcasters ask, how do I get my episode artwork to show in Apple Podcasts? Because, spoiler alert, Apple Podcasts doesn't work with their own standards sometimes. So in this episode, I'll share 3 places where your episode artwork can go, and the last one is a special workaround for Apple Podcasts. If you find this episode helpful and you think it might help other podcasters, then please share it by tapping or swiping inside of your app, or go to the audacity2podcast.com/episode artwork. That's also where you can go to see a couple of the screenshots that I have for you that might help you understand and see how some of these things display. That's at the audacity2podcast.com/episode artwork. Now, before I get into these 3 places, some quick tips for making episode artwork. There are a bunch of different images that you can make for your podcast. Now, I've done an episode all about 7 different types of images that you can make. I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode because it can be really beneficial to even have 7 different layouts of the same basic image so you can use those in multiple contexts and in multiple ways. But for this episode, we're focusing on 1. That is your episode artwork. That's a square that will be attached to this episode and display inside the podcast apps. So here are a few quick tips for making that effectively. First, follow the same spec as podcast cover art. That is 1400 by 1400 up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. It must be exactly square, not 1 pixel off, exactly square. It needs to be in the RGB color space. Use JPEG or PNG. Here's a quick hack to that. JPEG generally for things that are like photographs or look photographic. PNGs for things that are more like illustrations where there's a lot of solid color in them. For example, the Audacity to Podcast cover art uses PNG because that compresses it better than a JPEG since there are a lot of solid colors in my cover art. And the file size needs to be smaller than 512 kilobytes, preferably closer to 200 kilobytes if you can. Then keep your branding as consistent as possible. Think about your fonts, colors, layout, icons, the general mood of the design and such. Keep that consistent from episode to episode. There can be some slight variation, obviously, but consistent episode to episode, as well as consistent from episode cover art to your podcast cover art, so that if someone looks at both of them, they can see that they're related. And so that if someone looks at your episode artwork, they can see that it is clearly for your podcast. And one of the ways to do that is with the next tip. Include your logo or podcast name, but it doesn't have to be as prominent in your episode artwork as in your podcast cover art. Then focus the artwork, this is your episode artwork, on the episode's title and simple imagery that supports that title and the episode's content. Then ensure the most important parts can be understood if you shrink the artwork to about 1 inch square or 2.5 centimeters square. But most episode artwork will actually display almost as wide as your smartphone screen, depending on the podcast app, the device someone is using, and such. And last tip, remember that this artwork will show most prominently in the now playing interface of the podcast app, possibly on the lock screen, especially on newer phones running iOS 16 and later, and possibly on attached devices like a smartwatch, a TV, or an in-car display. So now that you have your episode artwork following these tips, there are 3 places you should put it to make it show up in your podcast apps. Again, follow along with the notes or share this episode out at theaudacitytopodcast.com/episode artwork. Number 1, ID3 tags. Audio files can have metadata embedded in the files through what's called the ID3 tags. This includes the title, author, chapters, URLs, episode numbers, other text, and, relevant to this episode, images. And as a little aside, I couldn't find that ID3 actually stands for anything. Everything I looked up for what does ID3 stand for, everything defined it as ID3 is the metadata tags for audio files. No one actually defined what ID3 stands for. So maybe it's like Ulysses S. Grant, where the S doesn't actually stand for anything. Did you know that, by the way? So it's not a typo if there is no period after the S, because that S doesn't stand for anything. Apparently, neither does ID3 stand for anything, but it's what we call it, so let's run with it. After that aside, though, Overcast and several other podcast apps use the image inside your ID3 tags, and some automations such as Zapier, Repurpose.io, web page embedded players, and certain importers into other platforms for other automations or playback or display, many of those also use the image in the ID3 tags, which kind of makes sense because then they're getting all of the data from the file instead of having to look at the feed, even though they are already looking at the feed. But some of these systems need all of that processed in a different way. So they are pulling the image from the ID3 tags. Any ID3 editor should let you add at least one image. And I do recommend that you add only one image. Don't try to add multiple images to the ID3 tags. There's some great ID3 editors out there. So in the order that I recommend, first, there's ID3 Editor from PA Software. This is $15. It's for Windows and Mac OS, and it, I think, was the best $15 I've ever spent in podcasting because it saved me so much time in this simple thing. It lets you easily copy tags from one file to another, as well as save an ID3 tags template so you can easily load that onto your podcast. This is especially helpful if you host multiple podcasts like I used to several years ago, where I would have multiple episodes every week, and I had different templates that I could load into this. Now, it's only $15. If you buy it directly from PA Software, I don't earn anything from that. I've been recommending that for years. I'm also a licensed reseller for ID3 Editor. So if you'd like to purchase it from me for the same price and support what I do, I have a link to that in the notes. Same $15. It works on Windows and Mac OS, and it's worked for many years, and it seems to be a perpetual license too. You don't have to renew it. I bought it maybe 10 years ago, and I'm still using it. They've updated it since then, and it's getting a little better and a little better. It just works really well, and it's reliable. It's actually now my double-click behavior when I click on an MP3 is it opens an ID3 editor instead of an audio player. $15, I think it's a great investment. If you want to buy it from me, I've got the link in the notes, or you can buy it directly from PA Software, and I earn nothing from recommending that from them, as I've been recommending for many, many years. The next thing you can use is iTunes on Windows, OS 10, and older versions of Mac OS up to 10.14. Or you can use Apple Music now to do the same thing if you're on Mac OS 10.15 and later. There's also MP3 Tag, which is free for Windows, and it's $19.99 for Mac OS. I don't know why there's that price difference, but that's how they did it. If you're going to spend $19.99 on MP3 Tag, get the better app, which is $15, and that's ID3 Editor. But you might also already have the ability to add tags to your MP3 files through your podcast hosting provider. Like you can do this in WordPress if you use Blueberry. You can do this in Libsyn. You can do this in several of the podcast hosting providers that they can let you automatically embed stuff like your cover art, your notes, your title, the episode number and such into the ID3 tags as part of your publishing process. So look into those tools that you're using because you might not need an ID3 editor, or you might. And my top recommendation is that one, ID3 Editor from PA Software, which you can buy from me or buy directly from PA Software. This should be the first and most important place for your episode artwork. Even if you don't make unique images for each episode, make sure your episodes always include an image. And that would be, if you're not doing unique episode artwork, it should be your main podcast cover art in the ID3 tags. That ensures total compatibility. And I've seen some things where on certain apps, even if there is podcast cover art in the RSS feed, when playing an episode in certain places, it won't show any cover art whatsoever because it's not in the ID3 tags. So for that extra compatibility and to ensure your images display, even if it's only your podcast cover art, make sure it's in the ID3 tags. But that should also be, if you use episode artwork, put it in the ID3 tags instead of your podcast cover art. That's number one. Number two, RSS feed. There are two RSS tags that can hold your episode level artwork. The iTunes :image tag from Apple's iTunes namespace. And yes, that is one place the iTunes brand still exists. And then there is the new modern podcast :images tag from the Podcasting 2.0 podcast namespace. You'll see these, especially the legacy tag from the iTunes namespace, at the top level for your whole podcast, called the channel level, by the way. And they can also be used for your individual episodes, called item level. These link out to the cover art that's hosted somewhere, like maybe on your podcast hosting provider, maybe on your website, something like that. But it's a link out to where your podcast cover art is for that episode, or if it's on the channel level, the top level of your podcast, then it's your overall podcast image. Like with all things Podcasting 2.0, the podcast :image tag from the podcast namespace of Podcasting 2.0 lets you do more than the iTunes image tag. Instead of only linking to one image, you can specify different images for different sizes. Why would you want to do that? Well, instead of letting some other platform do the image resizing and then worrying about whether the image is very readable at different sizes, you could design an image that's, for example, maybe only the icon to display whenever it's 150 pixels wide or smaller, or an image with the title and the icon if it's displayed at 600 pixels wide, or an image with the title, the icon, and more on it at 1200 pixels wide. That's what the Podcasting 2.0 podcast :images tag can do. And there might be other features in the future too. And do note that the iTunes namespace tag is iTunes :image, singular, and the Podcasting 2.0 image tag is podcast :images, plural, because you can attach multiple images to it. And I've got the links to the documentation in case you're wondering how to do this, but your Podcasting 2.0 compatible publishing systems should let you do this anyway, or it will eventually. So those are the two standard ways to add episode images, your ID3 tags and your RSS feed. So now let me interject with the Apple Podcast problem, because despite these things being standard, and one of them even being the Apple Podcast spec that's been around for many years, it's Apple's own proprietary namespace, doesn't make the image show inside of Apple Podcasts on macOS or on iOS devices. It still doesn't work. The irony there doesn't escape me. And I don't know why Apple has chosen not to support their own tag that they continue to recommend. Yes, their documentation still encourages using it. Here are some quotes from the documentation. If you look at it, and I've got the link in the notes if you want to look at their RSS spec, they show that there is the iTunes image tag for episodes, and it goes under the items then because it's an item level or episode level. And it says the episode artwork, quote, "You should use this tag when you have a high-quality episode-specific image you would like your listeners to see." But they won't see it in Apple Podcasts. It goes on, it says a couple other things, and it also says, depending on the device, listeners see your episode artwork in varying sizes. No, they don't. Not if you're using Apple's own tag. You can read the rest of the excerpt from this. They give some guidelines on how to make that image. But the point is, at least right now, that doesn't work. For some years now, the only places your episode artwork showed in Apple Podcasts were in episode search results. So if you were searching for your podcast, you'd see the list of episodes that match that search term. It also displayed on the Apple Podcast web page preview and when playing an episode from the catalog, but not from the library. So people who weren't your audience could see your episode artwork, but not your audience. But apparently sometime in 2022, maybe with the release of iOS 16 or one of its updates like 16.1, Apple ended even these behaviors. We used to wonder which behavior was the, quote, bug, unquote. Was it not displaying the episode artwork to followers? Or was it displaying episode artwork at all? Now it seems that displaying it at all was the bug. So now it seems the only place Apple displays the episode artwork is on the Apple Podcasts episode webpage preview. That is, if you go to like the audacitytopodcast.com/Apple Podcasts, that takes you to my Apple Podcast listing in your browser. If you don't let it open Apple Podcasts and then you click on one of the episodes still in your browser, that's where you would see the episode artwork in some form of Apple Podcasts. And I've got a screenshot of that in the notes for this episode. But that's not in the actual Apple Podcasts app. That's on the web page, but not in the app. Why? I don't know. Until Apple Podcasts fixes this, if they ever do, there's one trick I figured out to still get episode artwork to show in Apple Podcasts. Yes, it does work. And I'm not referring to the trick of changing your show level artwork every time you publish a new episode. That's what No Agenda does. But while that might seem to work, it does that only for the latest episode, and then it leaves old episodes to show the same image in Apple Podcasts. And any app that ignores episode level images would then show the latest episode's image instead of that older episode's image or the overall podcast cover art, because you're changing it every time to match the latest episode. So that's not the hack I'm talking about. The hack I'm talking about, or trick, we could say, because it's not really a hack, things were designed to work this way, is number 3, chapters. While Apple Podcasts does not currently support its own iTunes image tag for episode artwork, it does support chapters and chapter images. In fact, I use this for this very section of the podcast you're listening to right now. Look at your podcast app, especially if you're using Apple Podcasts. But look at your podcast app and you will see that the image right now, if your app supports chapters, is different from my normal podcast cover art with the red and black cover art of the Audacity to Podcast. The way I'm accomplishing that is with chapters. Chapters are a way of dividing your content in podcast apps. This allows your audience to quickly see your content outline, letting them skip to or away from sections, and they can also see a title, an optional image, and an optional hyperlink for each chapter. And for Podcasting 2.0, which already has a better version of chapters, I've submitted a proposal that I link to in the notes for this episode if you want to support it, to expand the chapters to support rich content like image galleries and basic formatted text. So instead of seeing only a title and a single image for a chapter, you could see multiple images and swipe through them while you're listening to that chapter. And you could see more links under a chapter. Just like sometimes when I say a major bullet point in my outline and I have several links under that, my proposal is that the chapters would be able to display multiple links, not just the one link per chapter and one image per chapter. But that aside, like episode artwork, chapters are a way of enhancing the experience for your audience. And you can use chapters as a trick to force Apple Podcasts to display the episode artwork. You can use a different image for each chapter, and Apple Podcasts and other apps will switch to that image while the chapter plays. And even on iOS 16, where episode artwork or podcast cover art now displays much more prominently and beautifully on the lock screen, that does change when the chapter image changes. And then when you play a chapter without an image, then podcast apps will switch back to the main podcast cover art. And some podcast apps might fall back to that episode level artwork through the other means, the ID3 tags or the RSS feed, if the current chapter doesn't have its own unique image. Now, if you have only a single episode image, there are 3 ways you could force this to display in Apple Podcasts and other apps that have this same kind of trouble using chapters. But each one of these 3 ways has some drawbacks. The first way is to make only a single chapter for your whole podcast episode and make it include the episode artwork. This can work, but the presence of any chapters, even if there's only one chapter, will trigger the chapter interface in podcast apps. This becomes wasted space and potentially confusing to see only a single chapter. It's like giving you the notes to a speech and the whole outline is merely the word speech. You don't want to make only a single chapter for your podcast. That is trying to hack the system. And when people try to hack the system, things that work often get taken away. So don't do that. The second thing you could do is put the episode artwork in every chapter. Since a chapter without an image will revert to the podcast cover art, you could insert the same image into every chapter and your audience would never see it change. Take this episode, for example. I have 6 chapters in this episode, so I could put this same image in all 6 of those chapters so that it would force that image to display in Apple Podcasts across the entire episode. Even though the chapters are changing and technically it's changing the image, your audience wouldn't see the image change because it's the same to them, even though the image is technically changing in the background. But this is a little cumbersome to do. If you're already creating the chapters, it's really not that much extra work to put the image in every chapter, but it is something to remember to do, and you might forget a chapter here or there. And it also unnecessarily bloats the MP3 file because each chapter's image takes up more space. So if I put an image in only chapter 1 of this episode, that takes up a certain amount of space. And if I put this same image in all 6 chapters of this episode, then that's going to take up 6 times as much space. Now, we're not talking about a difference of tens of megabytes, but it might be a difference of a megabyte or more, especially depending on how big your image is and how many chapters that you have. My images tend to be around 100 to 150 kilobytes, so it's not all that much of a difference. But if you have a lot of chapters, or if you have a much bigger image, like a 512 kilobyte image, that's half a megabyte, and you've got 20 chapters, you could potentially be increasing your file size by 10 megabytes just by putting that same chapter image in all 20 chapters. This also isn't the best way to do it. The third way, the way that I recommend, is a hybrid of these previous 2 methods, and that is to put the episode artwork in only the first chapter or first couple chapters. This will cause the episode artwork to display when your audience first starts playing the episode and for as long as that first chapter continues. And the reason why I say first chapter or first couple chapters is your first chapter might be really short. For example, the first chapter for this episode and most of my episodes is intro, and it's sometimes as short as 30 seconds. So if I wanted that episode artwork to display longer than the first 30 seconds of the episode, I could put the same image in the second chapter, and then it would display until that chapter is over, and then it would revert to displaying the podcast cover art for the overall show. This won't take as much space as repeating the same image across all your chapters, but it also means Apple Podcasts will revert to that show-level podcast cover art after moving past that first chapter or the first couple chapters, and maybe you're okay with that. Now, while this tip focuses on Apple Podcasts, I suspect it would also work for other apps that support chapters, but not episode artwork, because it does seem that any app that supports chapters, and a lot of apps do support chapters, the legacy MP3 chapters, and some of the Podcasting 2.0 apps especially are supporting the new Podcasting 2.0 standard for chapters. It seems that, at least in my testing, any app that supports chapters does also support the chapter images, which makes sense because one of the whole reasons to make chapters is to be able to put multiple images in there. We used to call that enhanced podcasts, but now they're in MP3 and we can add chapters to MP3s. So that's the trick to make it display inside of Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you could see that for this chapter, or I've got a screenshot in the show notes at the audacitytopodcast.com/episode artwork. So then, is episode artwork worth making? It seems that I've been asking a lot of is it worth it questions lately. You need to keep in mind it's possible a podcast app or directory still won't display your episode artwork even if you implement all 3 of these methods. And to be thorough, I do recommend you do all 3, at least the first 2, if you don't want to mess with chapters. But then you'll miss out on the Apple Podcast trick. But besides that, some of your audience might never even see your beautiful episode artwork because their device screen is off or covered, like in their pocket, the whole time they listen to your episode. So is it really worth the effort to make individual artwork for each episode if your audience might not even see it? Yes, I think it is. First, because it enhances the experience for your audience. If they see that episode artwork, it's a nice little touch on top of things. And second, because you can use the episode artwork along with several other layouts of the same design that I've talked about in my previous episode about podcast images. You can use that same artwork to make your podcast look better when you embed it and promote it. For example, I take the exact same artwork I put in my episodes and I post it on my Instagram profile at the Daniel J. Lewis to promote my new episode. And that's the same episode artwork. So if I didn't have that episode artwork, then I couldn't promote the latest image so easily and beautifully on Instagram because I wouldn't have an image to use. Please definitely check out my previous episode for resources on how to create your episode images. I listed a bunch of resources there, some free things, some paid things, some do-it-yourself, some people you could hire, and more guidance on how to create different podcast images, whether for episodes or for your overall podcast. I highly recommend that episode as a resource for you. I linked to that episode, 7 Kinds of Podcast Images for Marketing and Branding. That's linked in the notes for this episode. And please do share this episode if you found this helpful and you know of other podcasts who need this information as well. Share that a tap or swipe away inside of your app or go to the audacity2podcast.com/episode artwork. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go start and grow your own podcast for passion and profit. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the audacity2podcast.com. Thanks for listening.